Welcome to Praise, Prayer and Preaching with the Reverend Dr. Keith Garner, Superintendent and CEO of Wesley Mission.
As we continue here in the Wesley Theatre here in Sydney, as we continue our series through Lent, it's appropriate that the church's lectionaries across the world should bring us to the 9th chapter of John's Gospel. The healing of a man born blind. Very important that we note he was a man born blind, not just a man who was blind, a man who had never seen. And that's so very important in understanding the situation at stake here. Jesus is meeting a human need. But as always, when we read the Gospels and as we study the Gospels, whenever Jesus ministered to people, whenever he engages with people, when we see him at work, we know that there's much more at stake than what we first see. And so here we have somebody who is healed. But it becomes a direct connection, a vital moment in which there is a display of the grace of God. The fact that the blind received sight was one of the great signs of the Messianic kingdom. In a world where, of course, sight was so very important, when there's no substance to the idea that other people will be able to support you. There's no government aid there that you're able to turn to. Having your eyes is so very, very important. And for people to receive their sight, this was a wonderful way. Remember Isaiah 61, Jesus going back to Nazareth, the way in which Jesus reaches out to people in their need. Sight for the blind is a messianic sign. Speaks powerfully of who he is. And the passage is an interesting one, and it's a very extended passage actually, because it's one of these moments where somebody is not only healed, but there's graduality in the passage too, of that healing beginning to make more and more sense of the world that surrounded this man. The miracle arose from the disciples questioning. You remember, the disciples were always with Jesus, and very often it's the questions that are asked. Who is my neighbour? I mean, could there be anything more penetrating than that kind of question? But here they ask a question too, that I think is very relevant. As he's going on, they saw a man born blind from birth. The disciples said, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Now, the question is not a peripheral one. It is not sitting, if you like, on the top with a few religious ideas. It goes right to the heart of the issue, the scandal of suffering. The blocks, the things that get in the way of people believing and understanding. There is no question about it. In a form of evangelism that I once engaged in, we actually used, on the streets of a very poor working class town, we used a kind of questionnaire where we went out and asked people what were the things that prevented them believing in God. And you know, suffering was right up there at the top. Not because actually it is of essence the worst problem, but it's the one that we have to deal with. It is the one that prevents us being able to see so often. And it's the one that feels unreasonable, unfair, and that whole catalogue of words that come flying from all directions when people have to face suffering, especially in people that they love. Once again, I comment on the use of light and darkness. Isn't it interesting? Here, John, who right from the prologue has talked about light and darkness, uses those two images again to play off one against the other. The darkness that thankfully through his healing grace becomes light. Somebody who begins to see what it is that God is about to do. And light and darkness are closely related, can I think be conceptualized into terms of seeing and believing as well. And what seeing and believing is all about. Light is the most powerful symbol of all. Lighthouses, you know, don't send out music and they don't fire guns. They just send out light. And it's light that penetrates. It's light that guides the way. It's light that makes the difference. And when we begin to understand the deepest work of God, it is the light of Christ that pierces our darkness, that enables people to see. The light of Jesus is not just a way in which we can avoid needing faith. It does, however, give us enough to inspire us, to generate hope. When we think of Jesus as light of the world, it begins to generate the thought that there is a way to see and a way forward to know. Now, John 9 is this story of the blind man. Let's really get into the story for just a moment. And as we read the passage, we become conscious of the overlap between the teaching of Jesus and what's happening. And this is a style of John's gospel, actually, you know, that John doesn't have as many of the miracles and as many of the accounts of teaching that the other synoptic gospels, those first three gospels, does. But when you read of one of these great incidents in the ministry, gosh, there's an extended period of teaching that follows. And so in chapter 9, we see not only what happened to the blind man, but what light and darkness means to those of us that follow him even today. And the blind man brings to the fore of our thinking all those questions that we may have in our minds. Why do some people suffer loss and misfortune? And why do some people experience this and others don't? I mean, I think that's what lies behind the disciples' questions. They're walking along with Jesus. They're saying it's very good that you're healing people. It's very good that people are... We want to really ask you the real question. Why is it that some are like this and some are not? And, you know, I think that if you talk to people, I think that's still an issue. It's still a question that people wrestle with and struggle with to find some... You see, suffering is a scandal. It's a block in the way for so many people, causing folks to doubt, to distrust, and to disobey. Suffering can do just that. There have been times when I've listened to people trying to answer these kind of things in a simplistic way. But throughout my ministry, I have to tell you that I have stood with the people who've asked the question, and I've many times had to say, I do not know why. Oh, dear me. You're the pastor, the preacher, the priest. You should know the answer to that. Well, Jesus didn't give an answer in quite that simple way either. It is a scandal. But it is possible, if we get beyond trying to analyze things rather than focusing upon people themselves, there are ways. You see, the orthodox Jewish way of thinking was that there was a link between suffering and sin. And that hasn't disappeared. How many times, you know, we hear it, don't we, in the glory of the sound of music. I must have done something good. Absolute nonsense. It's lovely, actually, Sound of Music. Lovely. But completely wrong there. How many times do people say, when they're dealing with something, I don't know what I've done to deserve this. And again, this is deep, profound theology. What have people done? So now we have an understanding of God that directly relates to particular things we do and the end condition. Some of the most marvelous teachers and examples of Christian healing have all died young. Catherine Kuhlman, David Watts. I could continue a long list. And their lives were taken from them so young. And so there's no logic in asking that question if you're expecting an easy answer. Jesus did not go for easy believism and easy answers in this deep way. So this orthodox understanding of misfortune having a direct consequence of one's sins or sins of one's parents, even worse, isn't it? Not only is it your sin, it must be your parents' fault. The sins of the father, you know, that whole discussion was very, very real. And verse 5 is key. and suggest that in the midst of darkness, there is like, while I'm in the world, I am the light of the world. Light in the midst of suffering, light in the midst of darkness, light in the midst of misunderstanding, light in the midst of conflict. The passage takes the form of an investigation, actually. And the blind man's testimony is unraveled before the Pharisees by way of testimony. One of the causes of their complaint is that the miracle happened on a Sabbath. There have been times when I've struggled with that, and I've given my tuppence to the argument about these narrow-minded Pharisees and all. But it is so important to understand how important the Sabbath was to them. Don't spend your time condemning them for this moment. But that was the issue that was so important to them at that point in time. He describes the healing. You read on beyond the passage that was read to us earlier in our service here in the theatre. They brought to the Pharisees a man who'd been blind. Now the day on which this happened was the Sabbath, and when Jesus put mud on the man's eyes. Therefore the Pharisees also asked him how he received his sight. He put mud on my eyes, and I washed, and now I see. Let's open up the passage. Not in length, but just enough to be able to look over the top of that wall, as it were, and see something for ourselves that might help us. Jesus is rejected in the face of his goodness. You know, this is one of the things that I find difficult in the Gospels. You know, that here he is, he's healing the sick, his kindness is being poured out, and he's rejected in the face of all of this. It puts any comment and every time I use the word fairness, I ought to really say, hang on a minute, before you talk about fairness, there's one who knows a bit more about that than you do. In the face of his goodness, his healing, his grace, there's no doubt that they will leave no stone unturned in their desire to close down the voice of Jesus and to close down his mission. In this passage, there's a growing perception of the light of God in this healing moment. You know, there's an interesting, I haven't the time to do it, there's a sermon I've never written, you know, but I think the 9th chapter of John and the 9th chapter of the Acts of the Apostles have a link. If you want to go and have a look at it sometime, I'll tell you what it is. When we read about the one who came and became the great apostle of the church, and the one, it was like scales falling from eyes. Why, preacher, did you say that? Read John 9. It's like scales went up over the eyes of those who were trying to see. And thank God, when Jesus brings his healing power to people's lives, their wholeness is complete. But sadly, he is rejected by so many. Who's been the toughest person you've ever tried to share the faith in Jesus Christ with? What have you found to be helpful when you've been trying to deal with somebody who doesn't want to know? You know, it happens, you meet somebody and you're trying very hard and you know, really, they don't want to know. Has your faith ever led you to be excluded by others because of your faithful witness to Jesus Christ? If so, I think this passage here in John 9 has got tons of stuff in it for you. If you take it away and think about it. Rejection not based on logic, but upon the truth of God. Here's a man who might want to go and speak to the religious leader and say, well, look, you know, once I was blind, but now I can see. Don't you think they're going to say, well, isn't that great, mate? No. It becomes a moment of conflict, a moment of rejection. There's no logic in that at all. The way both the disciples and the religious leaders focus on the wrong thing is quite fascinating. Rejection is a part of the human experience. It's a difficult part of the human experience. I think whether it's young people or older people or people facing something that's happening in their working life or day by day, of all the things that are difficult to handle, rejection is right up there with it. Rejection is a painful part of the human experience. And rejection is central to the passion narrative all the way through. The one thing about Jesus Christ that is so hard for us to handle is that they rejected him. How could you reject such goodness? One of the most lovely songs that I enjoy singing privately is Such Love, Pure as the Whitest Snow. And yet, white as it might be, he is rejected. Rejection in the passion. But you know what rejection does? It opens the door for grace. You see, once a person experiences rejection, and I think all of us do in some way or other in our lives, and if it hasn't happened yet, hang around a bit longer. Because I think it's part of life. But rejection opens up grace. Because rejection is so unreasonable, it should not happen. And then in the place where you find yourself stacked up with all the arguments of why it shouldn't happen, then bursting through is the light of God, which brings grace into our lives. Where you've not earned faith, where you've not made your way of acceptance before God, but God's love has poured into your heart. Not because you're good enough. David Young's words have a chilling relevance. So let me read them to you. No one is dressed shabbier than he who uses his religion as a cloak. Those of us that are religious, whose lives have thankfully found meaning in the life of the church, where the Christian faith has been important to us, need to realize that religion can be a cloak for so many things also. Jonathan Swift, the wonderful Dublin writer in Thoughts on Various Subjects, put it this way: we've just enough religion to make us hate, but not enough to make us love one another. Oh, Swift, I wish you didn't say it so clearly. And Jesus is rejected by the religious people. Rejection, however, opens the way up for a deeper understanding. The Pharisees, in the passage that follows, wanted to settle the matter. They wanted to have it all sussed out. They wanted to have the man who's been given his sight, they wanted to get all this in perspective. And they wanted to discipline Jesus. They wanted to make sure he realized this is not the way decent people behave. You know, you can tell they're religious. You can, you know. And don't get all nice about it and say, that's them and we're not like that. Because I can see so much of ourselves in the way that these Pharisees behaved. The repeated question about the how of the miracle is really important to Jesus' disciples as well as the Pharisees. It was not therefore just a miracle, it led to commitment. Indeed, the passage, if we got the time to look at it, and we don't tonight, would show that the developing deeper understanding of this man who begins to see and perceive. Jesus, the light of the world, exposes sin and spiritual blindness, the falseness of people's judgment. He'd be rejected, and as we move towards Easter, we know that all those big words like sin and selfishness, those are the things he'll deal with. And take them all into himself. And that's why that other sentiment, that theological truth, he became sin. So that we, who knew no sin, that we might know the righteousness of God. I mean, what religion in the world talks about its iconic people, let alone its Saviour, taking on such a position? That on that cross, that his death for me and for you was to take upon himself the wrong we had done. Not the wrong that he had done. Lent is a time when we reflect upon the journey of suffering which led to the cross. The church's most holy celebrations all come out of the deepest of all sorrow. And it doesn't add up in our own minds. The blind man's eyes gradually opened. And he sees at first Jesus as a human being. Well, of course he did. He knows he's that, but he sees him quite clearly as that. In verse 10, how then were your eyes opened? And he describes his eyes being opened. But then he sees Jesus as a prophet in verse 17 in the same passage. Then they turned again to the blind man. What have you to say about him? The man replied, he's a prophet. So now there is something more on this journey to gaining sight. And then towards the end of the passage, when the gospel writer John starts to talk about spiritual blindness, in verse 38, the man said, Lord, I believe. And he worships. And here's a man who was blind from birth. He had not got the situation of knowing the city. He did not know what people's faces looked like. He did not know what towns and cities. He had been born blind. And now Jesus gives him sight. I can't begin to imagine what that's like. But it's a wonderful thing. He had been rejected. And Jesus opens the way for a deeper and new understanding. Let me move on thirdly and finally. Spiritual blindness is all around us. Hey, when I read this passage, I can spend my time thinking about the original incident in the Johannine narrative, and I can think about all the implications, but I believe spiritual blindness is in the cities of this world. It's in the world in which we live, and we see so many manifestations of it. The reason for our Lord's coming was so that the message and experience of salvation could be experienced by all. But the result of him coming was that many rejected him, and many chose to close their eyes to the light of Christ. It's an unfortunate situation that the blind man can be linked to many situations that we don't understand. The aggression of the leaders is important to note. But you know, spiritual blindness is very difficult. It's what we have to handle every day. It's what we're about. I see spiritual blindness in so many ways in terms of the way people are viewed. People are viewed today as merely people who will buy something. They are customers. They are people in this great big shop of life in which we live. Spiritual blindness. And the light that Jesus brings is to open the eyes of the blind today and to give a new opportunity of life. Here is a man cast out and rejected, who had nothing in life he could do but to beg, whose parents were even afraid to stand with him in the midst of his declaration, whose name, have you noticed, we don't even know his name. But I'll tell you this, there's one thing he said, that there'll be hardly anybody in the world who understands Christian hymnody that doesn't realize it came from this fella. One thing I know, once I was blind, but now I see. John Newton did not make that up. It came from here. That's what the amazing grace of God does in people's lives. Any visit to St. Petersburg would be incomplete, I'm told, without a visit to the Hermitage Museum. David Greatorix, who used to sit in our congregation every Sunday night, he's a member of St. Stephen's, told me that he and Deirdre went to St. Petersburg and they arrived too late to get into the museum. But he's a Rotarian, and he went to his Rotary meeting, And he sat down and shared the painful experience of coming to this great city and knowing he wanted to go to this wonderful museum that had so much Christian art in it. And there was a lady sat next to him and said, well, I'm actually the curator of the Hermitage. Would you like to go? I mean, all his Christmases in one. So he went. And he looked at Rembrandt's famous The Return of the Prodigal Son. Henri Nouwen, whose writings have been so important to many people, I think especially ministers and leaders, because they understand what it means to go through difficulty and to understand that the painful things in life can become the very methods and means by which we can communicate Christ. He wrote a short book on that lovely picture of the return of the prodigal. He called it The Return of the Prodigal, a Story of Homecoming. And he writes about the fact that when he saw that picture for the first time, he stood in front of it for an hour. Because he had never heard anything, a piece of music, he'd never heard a sermon, he'd never in his life ever met anything that spoke so clearly to him than the picture of the acceptance of the Holy Father of his Son. There was a holiness about that father in the picture that could not be avoided. Coming out of the scandal of suffering, we see this blind man. He no longer needs sympathy. He no longer needs bystanders to throw him a few coins in the box if they can. Jesus not only opened his physical eyes, he opened his spiritual eyes to see. One thing I do know, I was blind, but now I can see. Thank God if you know the light of Christ. Or if your eyes have never been opened, tonight just be prepared to blink a moment and look at Jesus Christ afresh. See him suffering and dying for you on the cross. See him reaching out to the one next to him who has more sense than the other at the other side. Said, we're getting what we deserve, but this man's not done anything. Today, you will be with me in paradise. Oh, we've got a wonderful time ahead of us, you know. Our Easter mission's a great time to share the story of Jesus and his healing grace. May our eyes be opened.